Tear gas is fired on peaceful protesters outside the White House as Donald Trump cracks down and threatens to call in the military to end the violent demonstrations across the US. A show of force underway, although many protesters remaining on the streets. We'll have the latest from Washington, and I'll speak to our correspondent, Ketevan Gorgistani. She'll join us from Minneapolis shortly. France enters a second stage of its end of the lockdown measures. Restaurants and bars open again from today, more children returning to school, and people able to travel freely around the country. And Venezuela launches a new fuel pricing system as it continues its efforts to escape its economic crisis. I'm Stuart Norval. Thanks for being with us here on France 24. So Donald Trump told governors they were weak and that the battle in the US is like a war. He told them to be tough and that they had to dominate. So far, on another night of protest in the US, that appears to be the change of tactic. It began as tear gas and rubber bullets were used to clear peaceful protesters from the park in front of the White House. Men and women forcibly cleared from a public park on a Sunday evening on live television. Why? Well, so Trump himself could cross it to brandish a Bible in front of the fire-damaged church where every president has prayed. Now, as thousands more security personnel have taken to the streets across the US, Trump Democrat rival Joe Biden saying Trump is using the American military against the American people. Ellen Gainsford reports.
As Donald Trump addressed a nation in crisis, protests took place just beyond the Rose Garden's walls. The US president described the unrest as domestic terror, threatening to deploy the military.
Today, I have strongly recommended to every governor to deploy the National Guard in sufficient numbers that we dominate the streets. Mayors and governors must establish an overwhelming law enforcement presence until the violence has been quelled.
Earlier in the day, Trump berated governors, arguing they should crack down harder and make more arrests. Demonstrations have been taking place across the US following the death of African-American George Floyd in police custody, reigniting anger over systemic racism and police killings of Black Americans. While mostly peaceful, some demonstrations descended into violence and looting. In contrast to the president's law and order approach, George Floyd's brother appealed for peace.
If I'm not over here messing up my community, come on. Then what are y'all doing? What are y'all doing? Y'all doing nothing. Because that's not going to bring my brother back at all.
Meanwhile, an autopsy commissioned by Floyd's family has found he died of asphyxiation from neck and back compression. This while the official report emphasized underlying health problems and potential intoxicants in his system. Both examinations conclude the death was a homicide. As the investigation into George Floyd's death continues, one officer has been charged with murder. But Derek Chauvin's arrest has done little to quell protesters' anger.
Well, meanwhile, back in Minneapolis, where, of course, those demonstrations initially began with the death of George Floyd, the situation has been far calmer. We're going to cross there now, speak to correspondent Ketevan Gorgistani, who joins us from there. Ketevan, a pretty quiet night there so far, particularly in comparison, of course, to the previous evenings.
Yes, it's definitely relatively calmer, at least from what we've seen in the past and what we're seeing in other cities. There was still one pocket of protesters left when the curfew came into force here in Minneapolis. They were located at that intersection where George Floyd died, where his brother came to pay his respects to his brother and where he spoke to call for calm. That's where the whole day really was focused on, because it was a day of tributes and of remembrance for George Floyd to mark 1 week since he died at the hands of the police. And there were thousands of people. We spent the whole day there, and there were people dancing, chanting, talking about justice and how to deal with the racism in the United States. And there were still quite a few people located there when that curfew came into place. And just minutes after the curfew came into force, there were police forces and National Guard who were kind of surrounding that area, who were trying to get people to start going home. Hopefully, if those people agree, they will go home and there will not be any violence. But the police are still here to enforce that curfew. And so for now, things seemed quiet, though I did hear quite a bit of sirens going off, and a motorcade of police cars and several National Guard trucks speeding by, heading into the direction of those neighborhoods where we saw violence. But so far, at least, still relatively calm here in Minneapolis.
Ketaman, let's talk as well about Donald Trump. I mean, he does certainly seem to be taking a tougher line, doesn't he?
Yes, the President of the United States simply threatening to deploy the U.S. military on domestic soil to deal with those protesters. He said that if governors and mayors were not willing and refused to bring in as many National Guards and police officers as needed to quell that violence, he would take control and send in the military. Now, he does have the legal right to do it. It is pretty complicated. He would have to invoke the Insurrection Act, something that hasn't been invoked since 1992. Remember those really huge riots in Los Angeles after the beating of Rodney King? That's the last time it was invoked. But at that time, it was upon request from the governor of California, who had asked President Bush at the time to bring in the military to help out the National Guard and the police. In this situation, it's much different because no governor, no mayor so far has asked for military help. They're perfectly fine, at least according to them, with the National Guard and the police. So Donald Trump is really taking a big step there, going against governors, and he's really trying to show his force and his willingness to really quell the violence with anything he needs. Now, of course, this is just mobilizing the military, not so much deploying it just yet, but the president is really showing that he's going against even some Republican leaders, because some Republican governors, especially after that phone call, that very tense phone call with Donald Trump, have come out widely criticizing his response to the violence. So they're not necessarily really ready to take any lessons on law and order from the president. The question is, will Donald Trump actually take the step of deploying the military on U.S. soil?
Ketaman, thanks very much. Ketaman Gordestani joining us there from Minneapolis. Now, to here in France, where for 8 weeks we had a so-called confinement. Then for 3 weeks we've had a déconfinement, not really a word in French or English as the rules were relaxed. But now we pass, into a second phase of déconfinement, with many more of the measures taken to stop the spread of coronavirus here coming to an end. The main changes were restaurants open again, although in the Paris area only allowed to serve food to outside tables, more schools returning, and for the first time people allowed to travel where they want within the country. Catherine Viette reports.
Carrying out the final touches before reopening. At this restaurant in Rennes, one last good clean of the floors, chairs, tables and bar.
Nettoyage des verres, désinfection des plans de travail, et puis remettre en place les frigos.
After being closed for 2 months, the kitchen is starting from scratch, with fresh food deliveries over the weekend. For the chef and kitchen staff, it's a busy day.
On va finir dans les alentours de 16-17 heures, le temps de bien ranger, les mises en fin, autour mètre carré, faire la plonge, le ménage, pour qu'on arrive demain matin et qu'on soit tranquille, quoi.
A new layout in the dining room to respect social distancing rules. The seating's been reduced to 100 people, a loss, but the owner says he's happy to be going back to work. In Paris, which is considered an orange zone, only the outdoor areas of restaurants and cafes will be reopening. Restaurant owners looking to maximize space are getting creative.
On aimerait bien se mettre en face. On a demandé aux voisins, donc juste rajouter quelques tables là sur le coin, sur l'angle. un petit peu là aussi si on peut.
Restaurant terraces will be allowed to extend onto the sidewalks and possibly into streets the city has pedestrianized. It's an idea that appeals to local residents.
C'est la joie collective parce que tout le monde peut se retrouver, à l'extérieur pour pouvoir retisser des liens.
As everyone hustles to get ready, managers for the 18,000 cafes and restaurants in Paris are hoping they'll have overflowing terraces well until the end of September.
And in fact, right across Europe, much reopening as well. Museums and historical monuments amongst those opening their doors. Catherine Viet has more.
Pushing open the heavy doors to the Vatican Museum for the first time in 3 months. Visitors must wear masks and have their temperatures taken before being allowed into the Sistine Chapel. Once inside, social distancing must be followed. Normally packed with foreign tourists, Italians are taking advantage of the relative calm, like those waiting to see the Colosseum.
Beh sì, un'emozione sì, anche perché si vede che è una rinascita, un nuovo momento, dopo un momento molto difficile.
Diciamo che abbiamo colto al volo questa opportunità, anche perché in periodi normali non è pensabile venire senza fare fila.
Historic monuments are also reopening in Turkey. The Blue Mosque in Istanbul once again welcoming visitors. And nearby, the Grand Bazaar is open for business once more.
Vallahi gereken hazırlıkları yaptık. Müşterileri bekliyoruz yani yurt dışından genelde. Bizim işimiz turistler.
France has opened its shared border with Andorra, prompting thousands of French citizens to rush to the Principality for cheap booze and cigarettes.
On est venu chercher des cigarettes, évidemment, comme premier jour de l'ouverture, on en profite, voilà. Et on vient pour des cigarettes, de l'alcool et des produits de toilette, style shampoing, gel douche.
But the border with Spain remains closed. French tourists will have to wait just a bit longer to visit the Guggenheim in Bilbao, the first major Spanish museum to reopen its doors.
The World Health Organization has said that 4 of the 10 countries showing the greatest number of new COVID-19 cases are now in Latin America. Nearly 30,000 now dead in Brazil and 10,000 in Mexico. The virus also spreading quickly in Peru and Chile, with numbers also on the rise in Argentina, Bolivia, Colombia and Haiti. The WHO saying health systems coming under intense pressure already. Now, for 2 months, Venezuela has faced gas shortages that are hitting all sectors and regions in the country. Queues to refuel can take several days, while the black market is at $4 a litre. Now, though, the country we're launching a new fuel pricing system alongside short-term reprieve from Iran, as Tehran is sending several tons of fuel to Caracas. Well, for France 24 from Caracas, Amina Fernandez reports with Ellen Gainsford.
Anibal Bastidas is finally going to be able to pay her respects to her uncle. His death coincided with a gas shortage in Venezuela. It took 24 hours for the family to find a car to transport the body of the deceased, at a cost of $650 for the 416-kilometer journey to the gravesite.
Hasta la fecha todavía está el muchacho echando gasoil porque no encontramos gasolina, no hay gasolina en el país. Y si encuentran gasolina, un litro te vale $3, bastante. Y somos de bajos recursos.
The fuel shortage is hitting every sector. Hospital workers should in theory take priority, but many aren't able to fill up their gas tanks. Carmen Villegas works as a nurse. After 2 nights sleeping in her car waiting for gas, she's decided not to go to work today so she can stay in the queue for fuel.
No sé, haber otro sistema para que uno no tenga necesidad de estar 2 y 3 días de cola. Aquí tengo mi almohada. Yo dormí anoche en el carro.
The situation is so serious that Iran is sending assistance, supplying 5 oil tankers. This despite the fact that Venezuela is one of the biggest gasoline producers in the world. But without investment and under American sanctions, its refineries aren't producing.
Irán está trayendo gasolina a Venezuela por el deterioro que hemos tenido aquí en las industrias petroleras, pues. No tenemos insumos, no tenemos los materiales necesarios para fabricar o para elaborar una gasolina.
Many Venezuelans hope that this Iranian delivery will mark an end to the shortages at the pump, if only temporarily. The country's population is already dealing with COVID-19 and long-term economic and political turmoil.
Now, one very stylish return to normal to show you now as the coronavirus continues to ease in many countries. Have a look at these images from the spectacular temples of Thailand, where people are slowly returning there to worship, wearing, as you can see, very elegant traditional costumes. One of those taking part saying they want to take pretty pictures, and the only thing spoiling it is the masks, although they do understand the need to wear them. The temple did actually reopen at the end of May, but it's really starting to see an uptick in the number of visitors coming back to marvel at its beauty. Beautiful costumes, beautiful temples as well. That's the latest on France 24. More, of course, 15 minutes.